First of all, just thank you to everyone for being here and collectively creating this incredible space in solidarity with Ojeti Seguin as they are struggling to protect their lands and waters. So I'm just going to recede a little bit and think about policing and state violence and the context that things are coming from. Okay, so as on Thursday, October 27, 2016, the state of North Dakota mobilized militarized police armed with guns, tanks, and cannons against the Ojeti Oyate land protectors. This war machine of settler colonialism was deployed against water protectors, against the protection of Sioux land and life. And I wanted to begin there and think out from Fanon's point that the colonized world is a world divided in two. It's a Manichean world in which the dividing line is marked by the barracks, by the police station. So that really is where we see the settler colonial state, is when it is violently interceding in Indigenous life, when it's violently forcing itself upon Indigenous life. We see it in policing, we see it in prisons. So this use of military-grade weapons on Indigenous land protectors has a long history within U.S. law, and 154 years before today, 38 Dakota men were hanged before a crowd of some 4,000 spectators in Mankato, Minnesota, after they had declared war on the Minnesota government due to calculated criminal neglect, deprivation, and starvation inflicted upon them. By November 5th of 1862, 392 Dakota had been tried for quote-unquote crimes connected to this war, 323 of whom were convicted, and 303 of whom were condemned to death. Lincoln ultimately ordered the execution of 38 Dakota and imprisoned the other 264 condemned Sioux citizens. And Heidi Stark writes this is the moment that in which Indigenous political autonomy and authority was increasingly constrained by colonial policy and law. And we have to remember that this colonial policy and law, as Stark says, was made possible literally by tightening ropes around the necks of Indigenous leaders. So in other words, American law, policing, and carceral system entered Sioux life as a regime of calculated murder and confinement, one in which to be native was to be defined as criminal. In North Dakota, currently, 26.4% of Indigenous children remain in the foster care and adopted system. In addition, Indigenous people make up 29% of the prison population in North America. So I want us to also be alive to these effects of this on Dakota life, not only within the space and event of this camp, but within the ongoing violence done to Dakota people through the prison and policing system. So the Steve on Standing Rock then is continuing an assault on Ojeti Seguin's Oyate sovereignty that has been made possible under U.S. law. And I think also it's a moment in which we need to acknowledge the 14 Indigenous Americans who've been killed by police so far in this year. And Indigenous people remain the most likely to be murdered by police. Menominee poet Kristjansson renders colonialism through its carceral spacing. She writes, take our bundles, shirts, bowls, put in dry, empty buildings, walls, more walls, jails, more jails, agencies, thieves, rapists. Take our children, take our hands hacked from us in debt. Christos treks from the incarceration of Native ancestors in museums to the proliferation of prisons and other spaces of incarceration, thefts of Indigenous children, and violence against Indigenous bodies. This is American law. It is an incarceration of Indigenous life. As Luana Ross describes, American law is a system that imposes on Indigenous peoples cradle-to-grave control designed to obliterate worldview, political independence, and economic control. And this is really illustrated by a statement made by Canada's first Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, when he was in the process of overthrowing rebellions, the Northwest Rebellion by Cree and Métis folks. He said, "The execution of Indians ought to convince the red man that the white man governs." So this governance is enshrined, is produced through calculated murder, right? So Heidi Stark also points us to how by 1789, treaties would begin to contain clauses that brought Native people under U.S. jurisdiction for crimes against U.S. citizenship. So this is moving away from a model of like negotiating on a nation-to-nation basis to negotiating with Indigenous, to treating Indigenous people as criminal within the settler state. And drawing on Canada's success with implementing police forces and wanting to fill the power vacuum created by the withdrawal of troops in the assassination of American Indians, Congress authorized police units in 1878 in which Indigenous people were selectively deputized to police their own nations. Stark writes these quasi-military units proliferated. Within 3 years, this experiment operated on 49 reservations and included 84 commissioned officers and 786 non-commissioned officers. So from its beginning, then, policing of Indigenous nations in the U.S. was a paramilitary operation that targeted Native sovereignty and life by defining Indigenous political activity as criminal, which is really what we're seeing in the siege on Standing Rock right now. And this kind of came together in 1881 when a Lakota citizen named Crow Dog killed another Lakota by the name of Spotted Tail. And according to Sioux tribal law, the matter was supposed to be remedied by Crow Dog's family paying restitution to the victim's family. The case actually, the judge ruling on the case actually opined that the U.S. didn't have jurisdiction to prosecute an Indigenous person when the crime was against another Native. But the result of this led to the passage of the Major Crimes Act in 1885, where Congress gave unilaterally control the federal courts, giving them jurisdiction in Indian country over 7 major crimes. So these readings are all in the syllabus, as is the reading from Kwakwakw geographer Sarah Hunt, which she connects colonial ideas about the degeneracy of Indian reserves and Indians which serve to legitimize state interventions in these spaces throughout all of Canada and the U.S., both on and off reserve, as Indigenous people are seen as unable to govern themselves and to care for their families and communities. And this claim helps to reinforce the claim of the state over Indigenous lives. For Hunt, then, this divide between Indigenous spaces and bodies, as Luke Horner said, rendering them violable, rendering them as bodies to be violated, secures the claim of the U.S. and Canada over Native space and life. And as Luke pointed out, this is particularly inflected by violence towards Indigenous women. Tatiana Kaluni-Young, in her piece from a Native trans daughter, also in the syllabus, writes that trans and genderqueer individuals are criminalized, incarcerated, and imprisoned at a rate higher than our cisgendered non-trans relatives. As such, our stories provide meaningful critiques of prisons, camps, and reservations, and temporal and spatial sites that reinforce a white and heteronormative and sexist hierarchy. It is within these spaces that the bodies of Native, trans, and genderqueer people and people of color are brutalized and codified as disposable. So in her piece, Whiteness as Property, Cheryl Harris ties this to the way that U.S. law guards settled expectations based on white privilege and basically enshrines whiteness as a property system, right? So in U.S. law, whiteness enshrined the ability to own property and determine whose land and whose bodies were considered property. And Harris traces the whiteness that ground U.S. law in originating in parallel systems of domination of black and Native people, sharing a common premise, a conceptual nucleus of a right to exclude. And it was like solely through being white that property could be acquired and maintained under the law. And in an earlier 19th century court case, Johnson and Grams of PC versus William McIntosh, the U.S. Supreme Court established that the title by conquest is acquired and maintained by force. The conqueror prescribed its limits. So conquest is one foundation of the present political and racial order of U.S. law and incarceration. Abolitionist scholars of imprisonment have traced how racial slavery also codefines this, right? And particularly through the policing that came out of fugitive slave acts, and thereafter the policing that came out of the Black Codes and post-emancipation, in which, as W.E.B. Du Bois writes, capital punishment was provided for colored persons guilty of willful homicide, aside upon a white woman impersonating her husband, grazing him in the direction, stealing a horse. For crimes not demanding death, Black folks might be confined to hard labor, whipped, or transported, but punishments more degrading than imprisonment shall not be imposed upon a white person for a crime not infamous. As such, Ruthie Wilson Gilmore and Angela Davis has traced this moment as a moment and the system of convicted policing and labor that came out of it as the antecedent to modern mass incarceration. But the hanging of 38 Dakota men and women and the imprisonment of their brothers and sisters also took place before this event, and as such, the colonial logics of incarcerating Indigenous bodies to break Indigenous resistance and nationhood grounds how the U.S. prison system continues to function today. So in this light, it's like incarceration is a continuous strategy of counterinsurgency against Indigenous life. As such, Kalani Uva Young proposes an Indigenous abolitionist imaginary as the heart of shared liberation for all, one rooted in involving ideas about self-determination, anti-racism, transgender queer empowerment, demilitarism, and police and prison abolition. Land protectives and Standing Rock as holding an example of Sioux sovereignty in the face of U.S. sovereign violence, of enacting Sioux law over their lands, are engaging in an abolition practice that calls us to attend to the fundamental illegitimacy of U.S. law, of its policing, of its prisons, and they call us towards what Young proposes as the necessity of abolition for Indigenous life. Thanks.